Hey, this is April, and this show, SetSet Show, discusses cannabis, psychedelics, and altered states of consciousness generally. It's intended for audiences 21 and over. Also, I am not a medical expert. If you are looking to engage with psychedelic substances, please consult your physician before doing so. Welcome back to SetSet. I'm April Pride. And in this second part of my conversation with Jennifer Chesak, author of the Psilocybin Handbook for Women, we take a deeper dive into the cultural and social challenges women face when exploring psychedelics. Jennifer shares her perspective on the stigma around psychedelic medicine, particularly for mothers, and how psilocybin can offer support for mental wellness by addressing issues like anxiety, grief, and emotional resilience. If you haven't listened to part one of our conversation, please go back and listen to the previous episodes so you don't miss a detail of Jennifer's informed perspective. We also cover the importance of safety and guidance in psilocybin experience, especially for women seeking supportive environments. If you're ready to embark on a mindful microdosing journey, follow the link in the show notes of this episode to purchase Micropsych, SetSet's 12-week microdosing protocol crafted by clinicians to support safe and structured use of mushrooms. And remember, if you enjoyed today's show, please subscribe to, rate, and review SetSet Show. It really does help more people find this important harm reduction education. Let's continue exploring psilocybin's potential in women's mental health with Jennifer Chesak.
One of the things that you touched on that is the number one concern that our audience has, and that came up several times actually this Tuesday at our live event, and that is the idea of a bad trip. And I know that bad trips get a bad rap, and we should be calling them challenging experiences. It's in the zeitgeist, we call it bad trips, right? And it looks like some of the data points to the fact that we are more likely to have a challenging experience. And it seems, based on the conversation we just had, that could have something to do with when you decide to trip, where your cycle is.
Yeah, I'm actually really glad that you brought that up. So there is some research about that it seems that challenging trip reports are more common in people assigned female at birth. And so again, we need more research on that. But the analysis that I looked at suggests that people assigned female at birth may experience psilocybin even at different doses differently because of various hormonal aspects, enzymatic reactions in the body, and even the social differences that we are exposed to. We just have different bodies than the male body. And there's something to do with estrogen and psilocybin in terms of one might impact the other. Our level of estrogen may have an effect on our trip. So it just depends on where you are in your cycle in terms of the level of estrogen that you have, because it's like a roller coaster in the cycle. And so that may have to do with the reason that it might be better to do a trip in that ovulatory period.
Yeah, because I think estrogen is a serotonin antagonist. And so if you have more estrogen in your body and you have more serotonin in your body, and then you add psilocybin to it, I think I'm going to have to get a medical expert in here to explain what that all could mean. Because if I kept
Yeah.
talking, you would definitely want to fact check me. But yeah, we talked about estrogen, women, and the impact that can have on your psilocybin experience. It seems like women, I don't know, our lives are ruled by our hormones and our cycle and the cycle of that birth and I guess death. But thinking about women as mothers and using psilocybin to address some of the more heartbreaking parts of that lived experience. If you lose a child as a result of miscarriage or postpartum for reasons, and women using psilocybin to help deal with that, because we spoke earlier about how anorexia or any disordered eating is super isolating. I just didn't realize how many women were really suffering in silence. And you call it the noble silence in general is when women are suffering at all and they just don't share that.
Noble silence is something that can be related to trip logistics. Be beneficial to abstain from speaking. And that's a Buddhist thing, noble silence. During your trip, you might be a little bit more silent. And the reason for that, there was a scientist, her name is Dr. Suzanne Rush. She brought this up to me. She was saying that it's possible that language places this schema on our default mode network and would impact our trip or make us have less of an experience or a different experience because of the way language affects our brains, essentially. So
Mm,
taking that silence is a good idea.
mm.
You don't have to, but it's just something to consider. Going back to motherhood and some of these things that are very isolating, you mentioned miscarriage or postpartum depression or losing a child in that postpartum period. All of these things are so devastating to women, and they're often not openly talked about. As a society, we're silent about these things, and people are just dealing with these things in their own solitude, essentially. And we shouldn't do that to people. We should be talking about these things. But Mama De La Mico said that she's worked with several people have either had a miscarriage or are dealing with some other type of situation like postpartum depression or just grief in general. And she said psilocybin's not going to fix everything. It's not going to be this magical cure for these things. However, if you do the work with psilocybin in terms of doing a journey and then integration afterwards, it can be highly beneficial. And I think we're seeing this already just in terms of grief in general, that we're seeing some research come out about how it can be helpful with grief. It was for me, I've only dealt with pet loss recently, and I have lost some friends as well, but it was super beneficial to explore my grief during a psilocybin session. So again, not a magic cure, even though it says magic mushrooms, but certainly if we are doing the work with integration afterwards, there's some potential there for some serious help.
Yeah, because the ways that we are dealing with grief that have been approved for us to deal with grief in some way, meaning it's just easier in drinking, being one of those ways, or prescribed benzos, which the rate of women drinking has increased significantly, which your book brought to my attention. I'll follow up in the episode with those exact numbers.
And so, yeah, it benzo.
Diazepams, yeah, are often prescribed by men, male doctors, to women. And oftentimes those male doctors are general practitioners and they're not mental health. And so they're saying that after the opioid epidemic, that benzos are the next issue that we will be facing. And now that we know that women have been prescribed at a much higher rate than men, and we've now got alcohol on the rise among women, it's just so timely that we're talking about these alternatives, that there is no history of abuse potential, right? Like psilocybin.
Oh, psilocybin.
Yeah. But it is hard for people to wrap their mind around the fact that I'm going to take a drug to get off of my drugs, right? Because it's all been so packaged. It's been packaged so backwards and incorrect for so long, that to think that the thing that we can go and buy at the local grocery store is what's bad for us, but the stuff that has been personified by little mushrooms and people eyes rolling back, and it's all that's going to be what saves us. It's what I read in the book about stigma, and obviously I've been talking about women and stigma choosing cannabis since 2015. I found that there's less stigma in terms of my conversations around women choosing psilocybin rather than cannabis. Have you experienced that?
I'm not sure. I feel like people are still having this stigma around all drugs in general,
Yeah, that's
and
fair.
and so I think psilocybin is part of that. And I do talk about in the book, I talk about people weaponizing women's children essentially against them. I interviewed Hilary Agro. She's an anthropologist. She's getting her PhD in that. And she's looked into this extensively, and she's had her own experience where somebody reported her to Child Protective Services, the department of that in Canada, because she lives in Canada. And because she's very open about, hey, I'm a drug user. And hey, we all are. If you're drinking caffeine, you're a drug user, right? And
Yeah.
that does help erase stigma when we talk about that. But she openly identifies as a drug user for her ADHD medication. And someone reported her, and she had to go through this whole investigatory process about whether or not she was fit to be a mother. And that directly harmed her because it created even more stress for her as a parent.
Of
And
course.
she was really struggling with that. And it was very scary. Again, she acknowledges that she had a lot of resources to help her with that, whereas a lot of people don't. It disproportionately affects people of color that they might get reported and things like that. I think there's still a lot of stigma. What I hope happens is that as we have more of these open conversations about psilocybin, about cannabis, and things like that, that there's more understanding that we can continue to talk about this. We can be open about this. And the more that we are, the better off we are in terms of all of that. Now, that's easy for me to say. I don't have kids. No one's going to take them away from me. But it is a real thing that people have to consider, even though psilocybin is not going to make addicted to it. And we can use psilocybin in very safe, controlled ways that aren't affecting the kids that we're caring for and things like that.
Well, you can tell me if you want to leave this in the interview or not, but I find it interesting that you live in a place that is definitely not decriminalized, even. Right. And you are just writing about these things. You are saying that you've had your own experiences, but you're not continuing with them. And I understand how careful we need to be. How does it feel? I live in Seattle, North America's largest decriminalized city, right? So I
Amazing.
feel very supported here. And what has been the reaction from your community? You're probably in a bit of a bubble anyway, but still, you live in the Southeast and you don't live in a place where it's, like I said, even decriminalized. So, yeah, I'm curious what things are like
Yeah.
there.
Yeah, it's a challenge here. We don't even have legal weed essentially. And
Yeah.
it's just
Yeah.
absolutely ridiculous. My husband at this very moment is getting me weed at a dispensary in Illinois where it is legal because I rely on that medication for sleep and migraine prevention. And he went because I'm too busy. It is a challenge with the legal system that we have. I am a strong advocate for we need to decriminalize all drugs. And I know that sounds radical as something that Hillary Agro, whom I mentioned earlier, she's a big advocate for as well. The reason for that is when we criminalize something, all it does is create harm and secrecy. The reason that we have all of this fentanyl out there is really because people were just using heroin, we would have less overdoses. But they
Right.
don't, heroin's illegal. Fentanyl is much easier to transport, even though it's illegal. It's easy to transport, easy to sell. And we can even go back and look at the era of prohibition. It wasn't prohibited booze. And what did that result in? A bunch of moonshine that was really harmful to people. And
Yeah.
if we just decriminalize drugs and openly talk about them, then we can have safe conversations about that in terms of what are the safe practices, how can I assure that the product that I'm getting is exactly what I ordered, what I want to take, what I want to ingest? But when we are so secret about it and criminalizing it, experience, but that safe experience is challenged quite a bit.
Right. What is real? Is the person that's telling me I'm going to feel this way and I should do it this way, is lived experience similar to mine? Am I going to get the same outcome because we're going in with the same mindset, right? There's such a need for people who can benefit from one another because they do have shared life experience to find one another and to be able to talk about these things freely. But I think that's where the concern for legalities comes in. We started hosting these events in Seattle, and this Tuesday was the second one. We had one 2 weeks before that. And I don't know, I guess I thought that there were people meeting up all the time doing this underground. They apparently know that people are really searching for groups where they can openly discuss this and get more information and also just find like-minded people so that they feel like they're on the right path for themselves and that they've got support in that. So yeah, I think that decriminalizing this so people just feel like they can even talk about it without concern.
Right. All the hush. I think that's
Yeah.
such a valuable part of the experience is that discussion afterwards with like-minded people who've maybe gone through a journey, had some similar experiences, understand the constructs of what went on. Because when you start describing your own journey, which I do in chapter 1 of the book, it can when I've been talking about that experience just in general circles with people who've not tried psilocybin, I feel like I sound extremely woo, and there's nothing against woo, but I'm very, like, scientific, and so people look
Yeah.
at "You're
Yeah.
science gen," as one of my friends calls me,
Science gen.
right? And so when you can share that with someone else who's also gone on a journey, even though their trip is completely different, they understand that wow factor, those mystical experiences that you've had, and they can help you navigate.
Okay, this brings me into a part of your book that I think is really important, which is there's research with cancer patients. After 6 months, 80% of them had still had significantly increased lifestyle outcomes. And again, we can get on into all the specifics of the data, but you point out that the larger doses and the mystical experiences that were invoked by those are credited with having an impact on those long lasting positive experiences. I feel like it's microdosing that people are really putting in the bucket of therapeutic. And I think it's really critical that people understand that when you consume a large amount of psilocybin and you have an experience that's close to awe or is awe inducing, that also can be quite life changing.
Yeah.
Right? Yeah.
And I do think that the trip is not required, but that is where a lot of benefit comes from. Doing the journey, the deeper journey, doesn't have to be a heroic dose, but maybe just a medium or large dose to have that trip experience in a safe, contained way. Can be highly beneficial because you will get some of those mystical aspects, this idea of what we talk about in terms of ego death, which can sound really scary, but it doesn't have to be. It's not like everyone loses their sense of self. It's more that you lose that sense of, oh, I'm so focused on me that I forget that I'm part of this big, beautiful universe. And that can be so mystical and highly beneficial. And that idea of oceanic boundlessness, where you feel very much at one with nature or perhaps animals that are around you or creatures that are around you, trees. And one of the mystical aspects of my journey was feeling this sense that I was connected by a thread of light to everyone I know and love, who I know loves and cares for me and supports me back. And feeling that sensation was one of the most profound things I've ever experienced. And I've carried it with me and talked about it to these friends who I felt this connection to. And they're like, I feel that too right now talking to you.
Mm.
A really cool thing, very valuable. I highly recommend it.
Look on your face if people are just listening. Yeah, it's an experience that obviously was touching. And most people say that psychedelic experiences rank in the top 3 of their life.
Yes.
So I'm glad that you had that experience.
Thank
But I really don't like talking about this very much, but it's so important. And that is that we go into these experiences or the idea that we're going to take psychedelics and positive changes on the other side. There is just like the information around psilocybin in terms of dosing and which variety should I choose and how do I integrate is very secretive. There is another secret in the psychedelic community, and that is that sexual abuse is rampant. And I don't think that we should be surprised that something that involves drugs and secrecy and people in positions of power, that it's just not ripe for abuse. And you and I spoke about a specific podcast series that New York Magazine did, and you referenced this in your book about it's called Power Trip, and it is about this often left out secret in the psychedelic community. And as women in particular are looking for facilitators and looking for psilocybin assisted therapy, a couple of things. One, the facilitators who I trust the most, there's always 2 of them. There's a woman and there's a man, and they work together to guide their clients or their patients. And it could go back to the woo-woo reason. You've got a representation of the masculine and the feminine, which is critical, right? I also just think for harm reduction and witness and safety, why not have more than one person there? Is there anything else that obviously you have, I think it's in a chapter dedicated to this. So there's a lot that we can go into about this, but fries is something that comes to mind that would be really important to discuss for sure.
Yeah, I'm happy to talk about that. It's a very difficult topic, obviously, and I'm devastated that this is happening, but we have to be talking about it because I do want to make people aware. And yes, that podcast, I highly recommend it. It's Cover Story Power Trip by New York Magazine. Lily K. Ross is one of the hosts, producers, etc. And she just goes through it in a very good explanation of what is happening. But essentially, in a nutshell, there are guides, therapists, etc., who are sexually assaulting their clients. And one of the things that people need to be really aware of is how much psilocybin makes you more vulnerable and it opens your mind to things. And so if someone is taking advantage of that, yeah, they could convince you to engage in some type of sexual contact with them. And that is what is happening. Now, obviously, it doesn't happen to everyone, but it is something that is out there. And so we do need to be vetting our guides, therapists, etc. Again, consent is not the onus on the person that ends up being assaulted. That's not the case. That's not what I'm trying to say. I just want to raise awareness about that. So I think a couple of really good practices, if you're looking for a guide or a therapist or something, is to see if you can meet with them ahead of time. They should have a conversation about consent with you. They should also be asking everything about you, including your history of trauma, your medications, all of that. If they aren't checking in on that, that would signal to me that they don't really care about you. But yes, you brought up this acronym FRIES, FRIES. This is something that the social worker Natalie Villanova that I mentioned earlier explained to me. She studies stuff regarding psilocybin, but this FRIES acronym is actually unrelated to that. I mean, we can translate that to our psilocybin sessions. So she works with teens and she tries to explain consent to them using this acronym, and it's brilliant. The F stands for freely given. The R is reversible, and I'll go through these individually. Informed is the I, and then E is enthusiastic, and the S is specific. So consent needs to be freely given. This means that you're not under the influence and you're not being coerced or manipulated into giving it. But in the context of a psilocybin session, you might have a pre-session conversation, just as I described, where perhaps your practitioner might say something like, "Are you okay with touch or me holding your hand if something difficult comes up?" And if you, as the person who is going to go into this session, if you say no to that, they shouldn't be pushing that on you. But that does happen sometimes. The reversible component means that you always have the right to change your mind about anything that you have consented to so far. And that's no matter where you are in the session. But reversal only works in one way. A yes can always become a no. So if you've consented before your session to yes, you can hold my hand. You can revoke that consent. But what I mean that it's not reversed is that if you've said no pre-session to hand holding, your practitioner should not then in the middle of the session when you're on psilocybin suddenly say, "Hey, are you okay with me holding your hand?" You've already said no to that. So you can't suddenly say yes when you're under the influence. So that's the point there. Then informed means that you know exactly what you're getting into when you've said yes to something. A guide or therapist should be clear with you beforehand about what to expect. So including ideas about touch or anything like that. And touch does not even have to happen. That's just something that you could talk about in advance. So enthusiastic in the context of a sexual experience unrelated to psychedelics means that the person is into what's happening and can agree to it. It's not just maybe kind of thing. In a psilocybin experience, if somebody is not enthusiastic about touch or something like that in that pre-session conversation, that's a clear no on their part. And the therapist needs to be acknowledging that. And then the last part is specific in terms of sex, again, unrelated to psilocybin. That's in terms of we're moving forward, we're advancing in the sexual experience that we're having and going a little deeper. We need to be getting consent from people along the way. And so that same thing applies in a psilocybin session where sex should not be a part of that at all when you're with a therapist or a guide or whatever. But they need to be checking in with you about everything along the way. That's the specific component. So I think FRIES is a great acronym for all of it.
Yeah. Is there a reason why women should work with men? I see that as a woman raising 2 sons, and I love men, but to be in an altered state and it just feels like you're super vulnerable. I don't know.
But it can happen between a woman and a woman, this consent violation as well. What happened for me with my guide, whom I felt very comfortable with, he's a guy, and he brought his mom as my trip sitter. So she was there, and I never felt so safe in my life. And like, I've
I
got a mom
bet.
looking after me. I had felt very comfortable with him, but I was very adamant about having a female present, and that was granted to me. So I think that can be beneficial in terms of having someone that you really trust who's with you.
Oh, yes. That actually is another thing that's come up. Like, we can talk about setting and being in a comfortable place and making sure you have water and great sound options and a place that's shady if you're outside. But the most critical thing is the people that you choose to be with when you're in that altered state. So that
Yes.
also includes the coach or facilitator that you may be working with.
Those other clients are there as well, and
Yeah.
they can be problematic with consent towards you as well. It just depends on what's going on. So it's just
Yeah.
something to be aware of.
We are at our 1 hour.
I know.
I know. I think we got a lot in, but I know that there's a lot that we can still talk about. I'm going to listen to this tape, and I obviously have this 27-page outline with lots of notes.
Yeah.
So if there's anything that I think we should circle back on, maybe we could have another
Yeah.
follow-up session. And then, I do want to get in touch with you about coming to Seattle because there is a lot of interest in what the conversation that you've started.
That's
And
amazing.
so it would be great to have you lead that conversation.
Sure.
Yeah. So I just want to schedule a time maybe next week that we can talk and figure out what that looks like.
Okay.
Maybe talk, I don't know if you're like working with your publisher and they have a way that they promo books and they might want to give you ideas like, oh, we've seen it done when there's a panel and you should also have this person on the panel, or it's no, she's the expert.
Sure.
I have no idea how to promote a book.
Yeah, I'll ask her about
Oh,
that
okay.
as well. And I do have some potential people I could partner with. There is a woman who just wrote a book on, I think it was MDMA. And
Mhm.
so that might be a possibility. But yeah, we can talk about that. I know you've got to go. So we can talk
Sure.
about, we'll figure everything out. I'd love
Okay.
to come. That's the bottom line.
I know. Yeah, I know. I don't know if I think when I think about this summer, it is June, maybe this summer, but it needs to happen this summer in terms of the book just came out. And I don't think it should be hard to do that.
I have flexibility in July, so we could definitely figure that out.
Thanks so much for your time. I'm glad this worked out. I'm looking forward to listening to the tape. And
Thank you. I
Okay.
appreciate your time too.
no.
Okay. Tell me
Yeah.
later. No big deal.
I'm working with my team to put together a content calendar. So we're figuring all of that out.
Okay.
But you can tell me when an ideal time for it to air would be, and we can make that happen.
Yeah, really, anytime in the next 2 to 3 months is great. So,
Okay.
you got
That's-
it. I'm
Yes,
cool with
that will happen sooner rather than
it.
later.
Okay. Thank you so much.
Have a good weekend.
You too.
Thank you for joining us for today's show. I'm April, and I'll be back the next installment of SetSet Show, where we cover everything you need to have a safe, supported psychedelic experience in the wild. If you're starting to think about holiday gifts, SetSet has you covered. For the stoners and psychonauts on your list, SetSet's Psychedelic Cards, a card game to enhance connection and exploration during altered states. Go to getsetset.com, that's GETSETSET.com, and get 1 deck of cards for free when you purchase 2 decks. Enter the number 3, FOR, the number 2 at checkout. That's 3, FOR, 2 at getsetset.com.